Study Session 8: Psychological and Moral Egoism. Introduction. In this study session, we will discuss the claims of psychological and moral egoism in relation to the basic objectives of morality as a social enterprise. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to highlight the main claims of psychological egoism and moral egoism, and discuss the possibility of both variants of egoism in relation to the basic objectives of morality as a social enterprise. Psychological egoism. Psychological egoism maintains that human beings are constituted by nature such that they are always motivated to act on the basis of only self-interest. In all human actions, people aim to benefit themselves, to gain something they consider good for themselves. The position of the psychological egoist is that people naturally care first for themselves and care about other people only if and to the extent that this will eventually is in their own interest. One of the advocates of psychological egoism is Thomas Hobbes. He affirms that all voluntary human actions tend to the benefit or good of the agent. For the psychological egoist, whenever there are conflicts of interest, people would always sacrifice the interest of others in order to enhance their own self-interest or well-being, or at least to protect their own interest or well-being. People behave egoistically when they act to the objective of benefiting their own interests at the expense of interests or the well-being of other people. Hence, it is important to note that people behave egoistically only when in pursuing their own self-interest they sacrifice the interest of others. Altruism is the opposite of egoism. People behave altruistically when they act contrary to their self-interest in order to benefit or protect the interests of others. An example of an altruistic act is the coastal guard who risked his life in order to save the life of a drowning child. There is a natural tension between psychological egoism and altruism, since both cannot be true together. If people behave altruistically, then psychological egoism cannot be true, and vice versa. If people are by nature purely motivated to act on the basis of self-interest, then it becomes impossible to sacrifice their self-interest in order to benefit or protect the interests of other people. That is, people by their nature cannot do what they believe is not in their self-interest, and also cannot refrain from what is seen to be in their own interest. Note: in philosophy, egoism is the theory that oneself is or should be the motivation and the goal of one's own action. Egoism has two variants: descriptive or normative. The descriptive, that is positive variant, conceives egoism as a factual description of human affairs. That is, people are motivated by their own interests and desires, and they cannot be described otherwise. The normative variant proposes that people should be so motivated regardless of what presently motivates their behavior. Critical examination of psychological egoism. Psychological egoists contend that those cases of apparent self-sacrifice are ultimately motivated by self-interest. They argue that people act in order to satisfy their desires and derive some measure of pleasure, and what appears to be altruistic actions are really embarked upon in order to satisfy the desire of the agent. For instance, a coastal lifeguard that gets into the stormy waters in order to save a drowning child does so primarily because of the desire to save the child and the expectation that he will derive some measure of pleasure from the act. For psychological egoists, saving the child is not an end in itself, but rather a means to the self-interested aim of getting pleasure or happiness. At this point, there are two problems with the position of the psychological egoist. First, it is doubtful that everyone's ultimate reason for acting is always the purely self-interested reason of deriving pleasure or happiness. If this were to be true, people would always do what would make them most happy. But the reality is that this is not always the case. For instance, a young man, Richard, might actually prefer to watch the final match of the World Cup football competition than visit his sick granddad. Watching the match would give him more pleasure than sitting in a smelly room with a sick person for 90 minutes. He believes that the experience will be boring and depressing to him. However, Richard also knows that the granddad would be very disappointed if he did not go for the visit, and for this reason decides to sacrifice the football match for the visit to his grandparents. Definitely, contrary to the position of the psychological egoist, this will not bring more happiness to Richard. Secondly, if it is true, as psychological egoists maintain, that people are always motivated by their self-interest and always concerned with their own desires and happiness, then it is not clear how they can consistently maintain that people could have desires to benefit others and derive happiness and satisfaction from benefiting others. If we desire to benefit or protect the interests of others and also derive some measure of happiness from these, then we are not motivated exclusively by self-interest. Critics of psychological egoism maintain that experience shows that people can and actually do have desires to protect and benefit others, and also derive happiness and satisfaction from satisfying such desires. And often, these desires are satisfied by sacrificing certain aspects of their own self-interest. People are not compelled by human nature to do what is in their self-interest if the effect of such actions would be harmful to others. Denial of psychological egoism. In contemporary times, philosophers are more interested in ethical egoism than psychological egoism. This is because of the obvious problems with psychological egoism. For one, if psychological egoism is true, we cannot but always act in our self-interest. This implies that the question of whether or not we ought to act in self-interest will simply not arise, since we have been conditioned by nature such that we cannot do otherwise. However, the reality is that this question often meaningfully arises, and this indicates that the claim of psychological egoism is erroneous. Another problem with psychological egoism is that it entails the veracity of the entire enterprise of morality. Morality presupposes our capacity to choose between alternative courses of action, and this is precisely what psychological egoism denies. It claims that, given our nature, we are incapable of making any choice between acting in self-interest and acting altruistically. Facts, however, abound, suggesting that people often do things that are contrary to their self-interest. Quite a number of people consume dangerous substances that are known to be injurious to health and life, even when it is evident that they are aware that this practice is not in their best interest. Besides, people in certain professions, such as the army, police force, and fire service, usually perform tasks that threaten their well-being and put their lives at great risk. Many of these tasks are carried out in the interest of other people. This indicates that people, contrary to the claims of psychological egoists, can and actually do acts contrary to their self-interest in order to protect or enhance the interests of other people. Joseph Butler, in his effort to refute psychological egoism, contends that self-interest is only one of the several possible motives for human action. Other motives of action, according to Butler, include friendship, compassion, gratitude, and a desire to do the right thing. Any action based on any of these considerations is not in the interest of the agent, and it is a fact that people are often motivated to act on the basis of these motives. Many people, as a matter of fact, do care about other people apart from themselves. Ethical egoism. Why psychological egoism is a theory about human nature, ethical egoism is a theory about morality. Ethical egoism maintains that each person ought to pursue his or her own self-interest in preference to the interest of anyone else. For the ethical egoist, it is always morally acceptable for each person to do what is believed to be in one's self-interest. The position denies that people have any moral responsibility to any other person besides oneself. Morality does not require people to sacrifice their self-interest to help or to avoid harming other people. One interesting relationship between psychological egoism and ethical egoism is that if the former is true, the latter becomes completely backwards. If it is true that human beings are naturally constituted such that they cannot but always act on the basis of self-interest, the claim of ethical egoism that people should act on the basis of self-interest always becomes superfluous. This is because, by nature, they cannot but act on the basis of self-interest. Thus, it makes no meaning to say that they ought to act on the basis of self-interest when, as a matter of natural necessity, they cannot even do otherwise. Universal ethical egoism and individual ethical egoism. Brian Medlin identifies two variants of ethical egoism: universal ethical egoism and individual ethical egoism. The former can be expressed as everyone ought to pursue only his own self-interest and disregard the interest of others, while the latter can be expressed as I ought to pursue only myself I ought to pursue only my self-interest and disregard the interest of all others. The distinction which Mendel intends to make is between the egoist, who is advocating that all persons ought to do as he, the egoist, does, and the egoist, who merely wants to behave egoistically while hoping that others would not do the same. Universal ethical egoism may be criticized on several grounds. One is that it does not express a coherent set of ends, but rather contrary ends, and as such, cannot be plausible principle of ethics. It tells us to do each of several incompatible actions, and as such, does not tell us to do anything. An example will make the point being made clearer. Consider a universal egoist, Jide, a philosophy student with the interest of having the best result in his class. His position as an egoist can be expressed as follows. I want to have the best result in my class, and I don't care about any other member of the class. Now, if it is the case that each of the other members of the class have the same interest of having the best results, for Jide to remain a consistent universal ethical egoist, he would have to maintain for each of the members of the class that I want X to have the best result, and I don't care about any other person, including myself. The inconsistency inherent in the position of the universal ethical egoist stems from the fact that there is a clash of interests. Such inconsistency would not arise in a world wherein interests do not clash. However, advocates of universal ethical egoism attempt to defend their position by contending that it expresses a consistent set of desires. For instance, J.C. Carlin argues that the fact that a universal egoist maintains that A ought to do Y does not necessarily commit him to actually wanting A to do Y. The example of a football game illustrates this point quite well. In a typical football match, Team A ordinarily believes that its opponent, Team B, should do all that he could to win the match, but yet does not want Team B to actually win the match. Likewise, the universal egoist can consistently hold that everyone ought to act in self-interest without really wanting them to actually do so. However, a close examination of the above position reveals that the one universal ethical egoist actually wants two different states of affairs, one for himself and the second for others, while the egoistic believes that she or he should adopt the egoistic principle and make success of it. He does not want all others to adopt the egoistic principle nor make any success of it. Thus, what is regarded as a universal form of ethical egoism is not really universal. To be truly universal, it would, of a necessity, express an incoherent set of beliefs. The eternal problems with universal ethical egoism leads us to the other formulation of egoism, which is individual ethical egoism. This position may be expressed thus: I ought to pursue my self-interest and totally disregard the interest of all others. This version of ethical egoism is concerned with the question, what should I do, as against the question, what should people do? The individual ethical egoist merely wants to behave egoistically while hoping that others will not do the same. One problem with individual ethical egoism, and on the basis of which it might be denied the status of a genuine moral theory, is that it is not universalable. An individual ethical egoist cannot accept that everyone should adopt his principle of action, because their doing so would inhibit the achievement of his own self-interest. The individual ethical egoist would rather that he adopts the principle while others adopt other altruistic principles. In addition, society thrives on a cordial interpersonal relationship that is essentially characterized by mutual giving and taking, cooperation and caring for the interests of one another. It also thrives on the basis of the general understanding that individual interests can only be effectively promoted to the extent that there is a modicum of order and stability in society. Hence, in reality, no individual interest could truly be protected or promoted without due consideration being given to the interests of others in society. A society in which its members operate on the basis of the egoistic principle would end up being anarchic, and human lives will end up being very insecure in it. Finally, morality is essentially a social enterprise designed to order human relationships in society in ways that will facilitate social order, social peace, and also enhance human well-being. It is, however, not clear how ethical egoism, in both its universal and individual variants, can achieve these basic objectives of morality. As we have discussed in this lecture, the basic claim of ethical egoism is that each individual ought to pursue his or her self-interest always, without any consideration for the interests of all others in society. It maintains that no one has any moral obligation to sacrifice his or her self-interest in order to protect or enhance the interests of any other person. Whenever there is a conflict of interest, and to the extent that the theory advocates a disregard for the interests of other people, apart from that of the agent, it cannot be regarded as a genuine moral theory. Morality essentially requires that people give due regard to the interests of one another in society, so that the well-being of all is enhanced in the final analysis. Study session summary. In this study session, we focused on psychological and ethical egoism. Psychological egoism has been described as a theory claiming that humans are constituted by nature in a way that they can only act on self-interest. We also examined these two variants, namely universal and the individual ethical egoism. One difficulty that is common to the two variants of ethical egoism relates to the claim that the only moral obligation that people have is to enhance their self-interest, and that no one has any moral obligation to sacrifice self-interest for the benefit of any other person in society. This position, as we have discussed, would not facilitate the attainment of the basic objectives of morality, would not facilitate the attainment of the basic objectives of morality as a social enterprise, which includes the attainment of the well-being of all in society, as well as the establishment of a stable and well-ordered society. End of study session 8. Thank you for listening.